Everyone. Welcome to tonight's book launch. Thank you for joining us to celebrate publication of Jay Gao's debut collection, Imperium. I'm very excited that Jay's here. He's in New York, but he's going to read for us here in the internet, which is incredibly exciting. And we're also joined by Will Harris, who will be in conversation with him a little bit later on in the event. I'm Jasmine and I'm from Carcanet, and I'm just going to run over some housekeeping before we get going. So just so that you're aware what's going to happen, we'll be together for about an hour this evening. I can see that some of you have found the chat box, but please do find the chat and say hello. Let us know where you're watching from and let us know what you think of the reading and the event. Just get involved in the conversation there, please, if you can. Please do, when you're using it, try to select everyone so that we can all see each other's messages, otherwise they might get missed. So what's going to happen is Jay is going to read for us, as I said, and while he's reading, I'm going to have the text up on screen for you as a bit of a visual guide. Now, while the text is up, you're still in control of your screen. So if you need to make Jay bigger and the text smaller, you're in control of that. So just have a play around and see if you can reconfigure it to suit your needs. But if you have any technical problems, just pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to help you over the course of the next hour. I said Jay's going to be chatting to Will later about the book, and we'd also like you to get involved in that conversation as well. So as well as finding the chat, please can you find a different button which says Q&A on it. If you get your questions for Jay lined up in the Q&A box, then Will will be able to put them to Jay later on in the event. So thank you all for paying your £2 to be here. We really appreciate that. Obviously, you will be entitled to having £2 off the book from the Carcanet website. I'm putting that in the chat box for you now. Just please be aware that we don't publish this book all over the world, so the details are there. That'll come as an email tomorrow as well. So you can also just not think about buying the book yet until the event is over. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Will Harris to join me in a second. So to introduce him briefly, Will Harris is a poet based in London at the minute. His debut poetry collection, Rendang, came out in 2020 with Granta in the UK, and in the States it came out with Wesleyan University Press, in the US, sorry. When it did, it was a Poetry Book Society choice, and it was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and it was winner of the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. And you can look forward to his second collection, which is also going to be published by Granta in 2023. That's called Brother Poem. So look out for that and check out his work if you don't know it. So I'm going to ask him to join me on screen now and we'll get going with the reading. Thanks, Will.
Hello, thanks, Jazz. Wow, sorry for this incredibly dramatic lighting. I feel like I should be in black and white. So I'm very excited to be here to help launch Jay's incredible book. I'm going to read the official bio, and then I'll say my own little personal bio, and then I'll hand over to Jay, who is going to read for around 20-25 minutes. Jay Gao is the author of 3 poetry pamphlets: Travesty 58, the most recent, Catabasis, a winner of the New Poets Prize, and Wedding Beasts. Shortlisted for the Saltire Callum MacDonald Award, he is a contributing editor at The White Review. Originally from Edinburgh, Scotland, he earned his MFA at Brown University and is currently, I think as of last night, a PhD student at Columbia University. Well, he's in New York as of last night. And I just want to say, on a personal level, behind the publications, which are impressive in their own right, that Jay is one of the poets whose books I was most excited for so many reasons. I think when I started writing, I felt like, even though Jay and I are, I think, basically the same age, there were very few poets who were reflecting my concerns, and it felt like there were very few ways to write about identity in this country. There was an expectation and an obsession with a kind of myth of origins, which Jay, as you will see if you've read the book or are yet to read the book, that he amazingly and intelligently deconstructs, partly through using Homeric myth, which is obsessed with the Omphalos and the origin myth. And part of what is so exciting, the way he makes it new, is through the reconfiguration of old things, and through actually not what he adds to the kind of corpus of British poetry, but what he chooses not to do, I feel like there are so few missteps. It's so clever the way he rearranges all these different pieces and influences. And I don't know anyone who has as wide a range of influences as Jay. That amazing voraciousness of reading and thinking is just really profoundly reflected in this book. And also just, I'm so excited for everything Jay is going to do. He's just such an exciting poet. And I'm very glad he's writing. I'm glad he's publishing in the UK, not currently resident here, but publishing here. And I'm hopeful that he will return at some stage, like Odysseus. And on that note, I will hand over to Jay to read. And please, as you're listening, make note of things you want to ask and questions. I would, the phone ready or a pen and paper. And I will disappear now.
Thank you so much, Will, for that wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. Hopefully, unlike Odysseus, I won't, my return to the UK won't be filled with so much labor, although actually the amount of time the PhD will take, it might not be too dissimilar. Yeah, so I am now going to read. Will the text be on? Yeah, amazing. Okay, so like Will said, this book is a sort of way of thinking through Homer's Odyssey, amongst other things. It's not a translation, it's not a transcreation, it's about thinking through the text, through the motifs, the impressions, the emotions. And so the first poem of the collection is a sort of invocation, as it was, called Hero Worship. I wake to stay in bed again. Decide every minor error of mine will remain broken in its wildness. Nights of loss now end peacefully and rarely with restless sediment. Beyond doubt, I no longer feel alone. Update on security incident is the subject of these siren emails, though it seems ghosts keep trying to hack the university's global trade route. I dream about our sacred technicians haunting around the anxious clock, deep breathing, remain vigilant. I remind myself I am the translation machine, excavated, I am multiplying. In the morning, it must have snowed, even if I did not witness it. This inert world seemed so buried with an off-white energy yet to be exploited. And I made a gambit to get my body out of there, a homecoming in disguise, my old return, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, aligned a few weeks ago without me even knowing. Yet I could still perceive it. I think I slept right through it, like a dress rehearsal before death. No matter how many rooms I gift my heroic molecules, they refuse to fall in line, to deterritorialize. To be honest, I am excited to know what aporias you will be planning soon. I praise our tenantless sun. This year, I resolve to be both at home and not. Wet with words, my fingers within language, then doing without. One childhood ambition was to project myself way into the past, like a statue. I wanted to end by walking backwards, trace slower circles in my back garden. In the distance, beyond the steel mountains, I hear a train slip back into the platform of its avant-garde station with a click, that snap of setting a pen's cap back on. The hands of a train are lifted straight up as if to say, okay, you got me. I admit it. I yield my tempo. Just let me surrender over all my worlded goods to you. And the next poem is called Hostess, which is a word for which we get various words: host, hostile, hostel, hotel, hospitality. And it's a poem that's about a mosquito, an encounter with a mosquito. And mosquitoes appear throughout the book as a sort of motif. For me, the mosquito is a bit of a monster. It's a sort of species that we sort of feel like we need to overcome. But the book sort of explores what we really mean when we say something is monstrous. And this poem starts with a wonderful HD quote, epigraph. Take care, do not know me. Deny me, do not recognize me. Shun me, for this reality is infectious. Flying home west, I hitch my pity onto the mosquito trapped under the cling film of this exotic dragon fruit salad. On its last long leg, we shared one vessel. Its authority to inflict human suffering unsettled me as I carefully ate around the heritages housing its stuck body. I'd read an article that said our kinship with them can be most compellingly imagined through the metaphor of war. You have killed nearly half of all the humans who have ever lived. There is little of history left over you have not yet touched. And so the article explained even expat mosquitoes will one day clandestinely evolve some resistance to their poison, artemisinin, with each new generation, unless we modify the fertility genes in the females, eradicate in an entire genus the vector for disease. Genius and victory. I have just watched the final scene from In the Mood for Love Again on this plane. I cried again. I flared a similar unpicked itch. Those strangler figs in Angkor Wat cause it a stonier intimacy, better left tongue-tied in the flesh. I wanted to be back on that buried path towards enlightenment. Try again the inauthentic itinerary for touring a mountain home for the gods. Pavilion Indochine Hotel, tick. Your prophylactic regimen, tick. Rain as warm as blood, tick. And my hired driver for the day, not much older than me, chain-smoked American cigarettes, texted his boyfriend, blared Kamar Pop from his tuk-tuk, camouflaged in Coca-Cola logos, later left alone in a Lucky Burger, probing the meaty dregs of a mango smoothie with a straw. I felt like such a nobody. And how I loved that bad air. How did it feel to have just conquered a world wonder, plundered it with the lens of a dirty phone assembled in Shenzhen, China? Even the foreign ear of a guest, cupped against a wall, can rob stone of all its kissing music. The photographs of statues I kept near to my wallet, like a deck of lethal military technologies. Headless men filled to their necks with stagnant water. Yet the mosquito and I, we both consented to lengthen our link a little longer inside our cabin ecosystem, perfectly calibrated so that host roles reign supreme. Homesickness infects us both. Nostalgic, I smuggle the mosquito in an old scar behind my right ear and listen from its blurry world below for the wet choral buzzing of lava, who curve their sleep beyond muddy colonies? Might they dream of more classic things, of past lives lived out in a touched and looted and ruined state? The next poem is a sort of eulogy. The whole book is a sort of eulogy, but the next poem especially is called Eulogy for Elpinor. And Elpinor is a sort of minor character in the Odyssey. He's the youngest crew of Odysseus's fleet. And he, whilst on the island of Circe, he got too drunk one day, climbed onto a roof and broke his neck. And the crew left without him, not knowing what happened to him, to the underworld. And he was the first ghost they saw when they got there. And there's something about this story that I find quite compelling. There's a few poems in this that sort of reference this incident. And I guess for me, there's a sort of, queerness to it that I find really, really interesting. And I should say that in this poem, as with some other poems, I deploy a sort of form called the stack, which is the sort of cleaving on the page that separates a word from the body of a text. And so in readings, I've been trying to find a way to sort of read this form out. And I've stumbled across reading the words down, then reading the poems, and then reading the island words by themselves. Eulogy for Elpinor. Empire, oceans, speculative, two possessions, can of epics always descend a war, become, learn these verse denizens, foot of paddles, find regimes, one, there, your hot, as refusing scars our everlasting pride from its we. Eulogy for Elpinor. I longed to terraform a hydraulic empire, silent nation with state-of-the-art oceans, waterscapes, both natural and speculative catastrophes, wet ports with no deck to smuggle your vesseled cargo or possessions overseas, your ancient customs. How can I cruise a non-native body in the body of a ship? In the margins of a galley, an epic wreck? My borderless mission was always to rest, to slow time down a little, descend a little, wait a little differently, mourn a little more, to sink that sun, lose this war, return to our bloated coast a little, become a little too modern so that I could learn to flow, to love, to curse, to fill out these blended censuses, whisper irrigated verse to extinct birds and other classical denizens, to circle back and bury any loosened footnote in the sand with the most tender of contracts marked onto fraternity paddles. In 100 years, I might return to find your eyes chewed through by new regimes of invading worker ants, dreaming of one precarious word to free them from their homely fealties. I celebrated your tan, your smile, your green willingness to wage hot war. So when my late tribute came out as wordless, as the long, indelible line refusing erasure, each counter-sentence formed scars swimming across the sea's skin. I admit our midnight territories did seem as everlasting as traces of a mythic, invisible ink we tried to ship, as dim as the soft inside curve from a blue shield shared, broken, bent way past its form, disoriented, still raised high after it's from tried, everlasting, our scars refusing, as hot, your, their, one regime, find paddles of foot, denizens verse, these learn, become war, a descend, always epic, of can possessions, too speculative, oceans, empire. I think maybe we'll skip the next two and go straight on to the sort of nobody. So in this book, I have a 20-page prose poem sequence. I won't be reading all 20 pages. You'll be glad to know. It's called Nobody, which, as some of you may know, is the name that Odysseus gives to himself to escape the Cyclops Polyphemus in his cave. And I have sort of taken that cave and turned it and set it in a sort of luxury, colonial-inspired hotel, California, if you will, but in Southeast Asia. Nobody. You were seeking an immaculate theory to save you from the hotel bar, a universal sign, a manifestation of your future existence in the weave of a doily underneath your bowl of stale peanuts. Or perhaps a monologue sprung from the oceanic currents, divined in the moldy mint compass on your watery julep, at a distant, constrained post, sense urgency in the mind better than hostility broadcasted out on the limbs. Who else in this hotel was longing for an elemental connection? Has any chance hospitality ever been paid back in full by a short script, a little betrayal, or some other ugly sentence? Nobody. It was not difficult to decipher the notifications on your screen. In fact, you could almost presage the language word for word, as if you had acted out this masked character role many times in a past life or two, alongside their forgettable and ambiguous endings. Each new push made your phone pulse with a glow that should belong to a rare but irradiated anemone, like a lush, distant flare on a faraway island nobody was ever going to scry nor discover. For at least a few more 100 years, nobody. Be proud, champion. You tamed the lion, valiant paladin. You were never afraid, mostly just bored. This island is full of noises and quests that sweeten the air. The buffet table mules underneath steel platters of aphrodisiac foods shipped from distant lands. Light jazz stumbles in from the reception like relief recently anesthetized hostages, as if you were a beast reintroduced. You never noticed the state-of-the-art mosquitoes engineered to carry nothing until after you were bitten, an inoculating spectacle, a red archipelago of bumps, rising, irritant, itching to be bathed in seawater. They can sense sugar in your sweat, in your sweet blood. Your mother used to warn about those twisted physicians, predictors of lineal, unavoidable diabetes. Nobody. Last night, you heard a mosquito curse, close, then far, then close again, to your ear, nearest to the pillow, like a swelling grand piano being tuned in an adjacent suite. All day you scratched at the humming wound that wheel in the fossa of your ear, not realizing you were even doing it, where a small gem of sap had grown like a crystal waiting to be mined. So the tempo of air felt charged forever, and all speech was made strange by your immune responses. You wish you were back in your hotel bed, listening to the scandal of a rainstorm loop through your headphones whilst it rained outside too. Spectral choruses inside the white noise machine, primal archetypes inside the black light, sometimes waking you up, sometimes making you sleep or squirm again, sometimes making you dream you were crying, sometimes making you dream you were raining. You think you see her there in the clouds' music, but the distant figure is never your mother. She's only the pale dust of lightning as it splits the ship in two. Nobody. Who adorned this bar in all its camp colonial fodder? Dark wood, varnished in some synthetic chemical, a sinewy discharge pulsing from each panel. An invisible wound will never heal. A memory of a weapon, a hand, a pen, once thrust inside an opening, a body holding back its imperial breath. The fake books on the shelves could never be cut open to record the price of commodities or ancient verb tables. You could break off those lamps, which droop like dim, melted daffodils. You could bring those twigs to your ear, politely nod along to the galvanic complaints. Remind them you are not the staff here. Then what are you? Motorized fans moved as languidly as history, pushing nothing around in their perpetually slow revolution setting, a lazy threat of decapitation. Behind the table of sweating artichokes, oysters, figs orbited by flies, resting watermelon slices weep like meat. 7 grandfather clocks prognosticate from the 7 most vital cities on the planet that there will always be sunlight beating down ceaselessly onto the pale skin of one time zone. Even the repeating wallpaper print, the same 2 continents from some cliche voyage of discovery, is mapped out indefinitely. Its pattern threatened to trap you in its endlessness, if not for that visible wall seam bisecting those islands, unevenly paired, pushed together, 2 irregular and jagged borders, one contact zone. And I think we might skip the next 2. And this is this is the last 2 bits of the poem. Nobody. Within the architecture of an alternative ending, the happy hour would never end. And you had all the queer time in the nation to drink your fill, to kill the time of heroes, to conduct an autopsy on all the covert anatomies underpinning the set you are so keen to disturb and agitate, to sneak out in the morning like a wake from a ship, to go outside with a monsoon shower was as warm and pulsing as blood, to unwind and drown in its droplets that fell heavy on your skin. The rain was wordless, sentient, each able to carry a mutilated world, but each, no matter what, each, no matter your preferences, your influences, longing to return to a greater body, yet to be judged as the most irresistible in the suspicious minds of the others. Nobody. Once this poem ends, so will the rain. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
That was amazing, Jay. I love hearing your work. And it reminds me of, so I had a list of questions, but I actually realized hearing you read those poems that the thing I wanted to begin with was actually just the language and the richness of the language, and not the, there's obviously so much going on the kind of the thematic level, the kind of the different like contexts you're drawing in and reconfiguring. But I almost, yeah, just the level of sound and wordplay, just little things I kind of I noticed, but I hear again when you read it out, like the play on genus and genius. Obviously, the thread running through it: host, hostage, hotel, hostility. All of those things from the larger threads throughout the book to the kind of phrasal construction. I mean, what role does kind of sound play for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think for me, a lot of it does actually happen without me consciously being aware of it. I thought of, I think I want to be a rhyming poet, but rhyme is not so fashionable. So now I have to sneak it in other ways. It just sort of, a lot of it does just happen. And actually I have to edit some of it out because when I read it back, I'm like, this is too on the nose, But I think I'm interested, as you say, in language, definitely, and in sound. For me, poetry really is all about fundamentally language, and who said this? That the alphabet is like frozen sound in midair. Like it has a sort of, it feels like alive. There's a sort of aliveness to language that I'm always quite interested in. And certainly in this book, some of its impetus comes from the French linguist Émile Benveniste, who wrote this big, great book where he takes certain concepts in sort of Western society and sort of traces the linguistic roots back. So he does it with, hospitality, and it goes back to hosts and then stranger dynamics, and then hostile, and it goes even back further to ghostliness, and that for me felt really quite generative as a way of thinking through the architecture of this book. At what points does a host become hostile? Does a ghost become a breath? Various misreadings. I am I'm not a linguist or polyglot in any means myself, but actually these sort of skewed slant ways of looking at sound for me prove perhaps the easiest way of getting into language.
Mm. Yeah, I love that answer. Like, so there are almost these two countervailing things happening. The conscious tracing back of words to reveal their contradictions, and the unconscious kind of following of the sounds and where they take you. But wait, to link to a question rather than an observation, because I wanted to ask you about you say you're not a linguist, but the role of translation feels important to the book, even though it's written in one language, English. And I know your academic work centers on translation. I wonder how you feel about that. What role translation has within it, or what role it can have in a monolingual text.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been, and I have dabbled in translation, of Chinese, in my sort of, as a sort of more of a hobbyist. But actually, I didn't really want to, I wanted to, I guess, I'm interested in the role of a translator who is a sort of character in this book who comes up in a few poems. You know, he's literally called the translator, which for me feels like an archetype, like the archetype of someone who is in the process of translating. And, you know, what does that entail? What various biases come with that? You know, and how much of that, and, you know, increasingly, as with lots of discourse in translation, and, you know, there has been debates about, you know, who gets the right to translate, can you translate anything, blah, blah, blah. And although, you know, that's not really the focus of my book, and I'm not so interested in that, I think I am interested in this, in the sort of the shadows of translation, the history of it, the figures, the figure of a translator, and how they might map on or not map onto various other archetypes in the book, like the hero, the tourist, the traveler, the guest.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking of those other big symbolic figures. The hero, the tourist, the translator. And they all feel like figures that you, as a poet, you kind of, your eye is like slipping, but is defining itself by its opposition to them. I don't know, do you feel like that's kind of the generative energy of a lot of it, is kind of avoiding the pitfalls of those large symbolic figures?
I mean, I definitely, you know, I think there's something dialectical or like, you know, happening between the binaries that for me feel generative. You know, I'm not wanting to write poems that sort of necessarily say, oh, the hero is bad, you know, or you know, or something like that. I guess for me, it is that sort of uncomfortable space, that sort of like, from which I'm interested in, you know, the sort of what am I trying to say? I guess that space that is in a way a certain remove, but one I do feel connected to, you know. That's not a great answer to your great question.
It isn't. Well, so the thing is, I was also thinking of the idea of travesty. So Jay has this book, but also has this pamphlet called Travesty 58, but they feel linked. And the idea of travesty comes from, you know, the idea of clothing yourself, disguising, which obviously links to the figure of Odysseus, disguising himself repeatedly and posing as nobody at one point. How do you link to that figure, the figure of disguise, you know, the disguised figure, the idea of travesty?
Yeah, no, that's a great connection to put them together. You can also buy the pamphlet; it's available. No, I should be plugging this book.
Why not buy both?
Travesty. I think for me, I was drawn towards travesty for the reason you said, but also because it sort of is a bit of a strange word. You know, it's not a word that I often hear, but it sort of comes with it all these sort of related words like catastrophe, like annihilation, you know, or you know, these big words that sort of signal to destruction. And I guess for me, I found that quite seductive because a lot of the poems, or there are some poems in which I am trying to sort of think about what it means to sort of write through atrocity and write through travesties of history that are sort of left in spaces that one might travel to, ruins, as it were. And there's a lot of poems in both pamphlet and book which are ruins of language. You know, there's a few poems which I've termed a sonnet, which are sort of 14 pages, and those to me, have been generated by this machine, number one, called a travesty generator, but also they are travesties of language, travesties of the sonnet form. I've exploded them up like the sculptor Cornelia Parker, like she does to her shed, you know, in order to sort of scry through the imperial debris, the sort of linguistic ruin and rubble that comes out the other end.
I love that. That feels like it links on naturally to the form that you've invented, the stack. Yeah, you have invented it, right? I mean,
I mean, I've given
Untitled.
it a name, you know, and plus taming it. You know, what's that line which is like monsters are that which we have no name yet. So by naming the form, it's now mine.
Yeah. Well, I find this. I think it's such a it's an I love it partly because it's such a frustrating form. In that, when I first started reading those stack poems, I really wanted, and I love that you read it out. That I wanted to read it as the final word as making a kind of continuous sense, but it doesn't. It feels like it obstructs the meaning laterally, but also doesn't kind of stack up. And there's something, and I'm in the essay you've written for Poetry Review, you compare it to coastal erosion, and there feels like you were saying about language, something arbitrary about it.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk more about that, or the role of the form, maybe more generally, in constraint, and the natural and artificial
Yeah.
aspects of it.
Yeah. So the stack, which I've invented. I mean, it's just a way. You know, form is always for me a way. You know, form is memory. Those two are linked, or memory is form. You know, it's a way of working through my various influences, and in an organic way, hopefully organic form, as Denise Levertov writes, or this idea of finding a sort of architecture, and so the stack is based, quite simply on sea stack, which are, as some people might know, coastal erosions where the wave comes in and eroding a part of the cliff, so that what you get is like the old man of Hoy, you get a sort of pillar of stone that's separated from the landmass. And that, what I found interesting about that was the sort of cleaving, the rupture, the tear that allows in all sorts of things, not just waves and heroes and myths, but anything I want to throw into that space. And then what I can take out of that space is the meaning from the words left on the end. And like you said, I made it so that they didn't read like a nice sentence, because a nice poem. I didn't want that, because that would have been too simple, too convenient. But instead, actually, what you get of the sort of, again, going back to this rubble of sort of words, you can sort of pick out, and this is the artificiality, you can pick out new ways, new combinations, so that every time I read that poem, actually, if I read it the same way, every time will be different. There'll always be a new permutation about where I put my breath on those words in the stack.
Yeah, I really heard that. There was something there's something really generous to the reader in that way as well. Like, I noticed towards the end the stacking of possessive pronouns, like one, there, your, are, then obviously ending on we, and then that word refusing coming in between that. It felt, and which you stressed when you read it out. And again, it feels incidental, but also purposeful. I just wanted to say, if anyone has any questions, now would be a good time to start typing. And so linked to your comments about the stack, I know, actually, I'm going to ask Michael's question in a minute, but I just wanted to ask, do you feel with your own work, this is something I often feel, an impulse towards destroying it, towards something and then unmaking it, decreation, that kind of thing.
Decreation, which I've just been reading, actually. I think,
or
and then Anne Carton, based off by. I think as writers, I have this hypothesis, and that, like, especially poets, we naturally err towards the destruction of our own work, of the language we use. I've just come out of an MFA, and all the language we use in workshops are destructive word. We must cut down. We must, cut away the fat. We must sort of reduce, make slim, make tight our poems. It's a sort of, you're sort of chipping away at the poem. And yes, I am interested in that, but I find it difficult because my poems are quite monstrous. They're sort of like they grow, they're long, they're ungainly, they're sort of, they could do, I could have been a better editor, but but the destruction is interesting because I guess in this context, on a very simple level, I had to destroy Homer's text to figure out what I wanted to sort of rescue from the bottom of from the wreckage of it, because clearly I wasn't writing a book in which every poem mapped neatly onto an episode of the Odyssey. There's references to the Iliad, to Dante, and there's all this sort of like swirling tidal tide of things happening that I felt that it couldn't be a replicated. It couldn't exactly, right? And nor should it need to be, but it had to be in some ways a sort of decreation act.
Yeah, I love that. I have more I could ask, but I'm going to ask these two questions that we've got in the Q&A box. Okay, Michael's question first. So I was speaking about your deliberate rejection of certain elements in conventional British verse. I don't, open to interpretation as to what that means. Doing without as Kafka challenges the writer to do. What have you specifically denied yourself among the conventional resources and why? You are certainly an ironist. That is Michael talking on me.
No, but it's quite funny. So many of the comments about the book and some reviews have talked about the sarcasm, the wit, the irony, which it's funny because when you're a writer, I'm not saying, oh, time for a joke now, right? But, it's not until after you realize that, for me, the book is like incredibly sad. It's like a very elegiac, sorry. But it is, yeah, I agree. There is lots of ironic moments. For me, I think perhaps I never really studied English literature at undergrad, and the books I was reading came from all over the world. I didn't really have a good grasp on what was traditional British verse, and I've been more inspired, say, by a sort of sense of poetics from elsewhere, from a lot of Asian countries, Latin American countries. And I think what that has meant is that, I'm trying to find a language of my own, fundamentally. The book is called Imperium. It's the image on the front cover is an Irish one. It's about Homer's Odyssey. I'm Chinese Scottish, but living in New York or the US, and the poems are set in like Asia and the Middle East. It's at its most, it's sort of me trying to find a language which can capture all of those different elements without any sort of too much allegiance, I guess, to one place.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. There are so many ironies in what you were describing, your positionality, that it'd be kind of hard for it not to kind of come through in some form. Okay, maybe that will feed into these next questions. So Alison asks, did you feel your relationship change with the Odyssey as you were writing your own poetry in its context or conversation? If so, how? And was there anything that surprised you about the process or the destruction of myth making?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alison. Thank you for coming. I tried not to read the Odyssey too much when I was writing this. Obviously I've read it in various multiple different forms before. But I didn't sort of like have it sitting on the side page open as I was writing my poems. And so my relationship to it didn't necessarily change that much. Other than perhaps the fact that I felt very keenly that it was too much pressure to try and sort of capture it all in, but I could actually only take away motifs or impressions or one or two episodes, the ghosts of the Odyssey, who I'm always more drawn towards. Elpinor is one, Circe, the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus' maid, what's her name? Euryclea, I think. Was there anything that surprised you in the process of myth making? I guess, for me, it's, I read a few years ago, I read this essay by Horkheimer and Adorno, which talks about Odysseus' myth, amongst other, and it sort of changed my perception about myth making, because it sort of argued that a lot of the structures surrounding myth actually follow the sort of structures with regards to enlightenment and modernity, and therefore colonialism. And when you think about it, it makes so much sense. Odysseus, traveled around these Mediterranean islands, trying to civilize, various magical, mystical creatures or people. He defeats them. He sort of conquers them. And that, to me, after this sort of revelation, I've become much more skeptical about myth making and mythology, and sort of thinking to myself, there is something too seductive in myth as well.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Like when we're reading Greek myth, we're only reading our appropriation of it for our time. And that, I think Imperium really brings that out. So I guess this next question definitely does follow on from that, which is, what advice would you give to those who are reaching towards writing classically influenced prose or poetry, since we have seen a huge resurgence in classical Greek retellings and modern interpretations of texts? Thank you, Zainab, for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, certainly, when I was coming to this text, to writing Imperium, I was bringing to it all of my favorite poets who were rewriting myth. Derek Walcott, H.D., more recently, Alice Oswald, for example, Sandeep Palmer. Do I have any advice about? I think a lot of the times there's this tendency for rewriting of myth to have to serve a sort of purpose. You have to sort of bring it into the now, but actually it should be the other way around. You're writing the poem now, and you're sort of going, then you're traveling backwards and forwards from it. It shouldn't be too much work to bring, from a few thousand years ago, Homer, and map it cleanly onto something, an agenda that, or sort of missive that you want to get across now. I always feel that can be a sort of trapping, but it's quite, it is, again, to use that word, seductive to do, because I think it is easy to do that. Not easy, sorry, but like it is sort of, one way of doing interacting with myth is to sort of make sure it has a contemporary sort of analog. But it doesn't have to have that in order for it to breathe.
Yeah, you don't want it to feel like a scaffold for what you would say ordinarily, but you're kind of reaching for this other thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Lydia has said, I was really taken with and surprised by the reading of Eulogy for Elpinor. If a fluid approach to the reading is a characteristic of the stack, is this indicated somehow in the book?
No, but perhaps it should be. No, I mean, I don't often, I'm not a huge fan personally of like long notes sections. So I haven't. I think there's an essay which I've written for the poetry review, which does mention ways of reading it. And perhaps I will write something more substantial later. But I also don't want to be prescriptive in the same way that, I don't think myths should always be prescriptive. Although, they do have their own moralistic, fable-like sort of architecture. Yeah, I sort of am interested in just, I guess, how someone interacts with it, because it's not necessarily a radically different form. It's not, itself, it almost seems like an error, because every line has that gap. I'm interested in that slight misstep, like of a reader coming to it and not knowing if they should pay, how much significance they should give to it.
Yeah. Because I guess the way we're taught poems at school is that there's always got to be a reason for something. Why does the poet use that metaphor?
Yeah.
Everything is very utilitarian. Whereas you're saying it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's sort of so much of it is about playfulness. I did it because I wanted to play around with it because I think there's something very ludic in my writing of poetry, something that really puts to the foreground this idea of playfulness. And whether it's successful or not, and I'm totally willing to admit that, some of the forms I'm still playing around with, this is not the final incarnation. It's important for me to have used these different forms.
I realize we are coming to the end of our allotted time. Jazz, do I have time for another question, or should I tie it up? One more question. Encore. Okay. So I kind of wanted to end on maybe a slightly more prosaic question, but which also grounds us in the present, which is that you're in America and we're in Britain. You just published this book in Britain, but you've done an MFA at Brown. That took how many years? I kind of lose track of time. So
2 years.
2 years, yeah. So you've and you were saying you hadn't done a literature degree beforehand, so a lot of your kind of literary education now is American. I don't know how do you feel the kind of transatlantic position you're now in? What do you feel? This is quite a big question, actually. This is a final one, but to be this kind of like straddling two places and two separate.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that's so interesting. I think it's no offense to any Americans in the chat, but I think it's quite simple to say that I think a lot of contemporary American poets don't know a huge amount about contemporary British poetry, which I feel is quite sad, especially the diversity of contemporary British poetry. But when I went to the US, I knew almost nothing about language poetry, which was so omnipresent, especially at Brown, but also just generally. It's, regardless of your thoughts about it, it very easily, or not easily, but it cleaves the sort of post-language, everything seems to be defined itself against language in some ways, language poetry itself having very fuzzy definitions. But I guess for me, the American poetry landscape seems to have far more movements and sort of place-based groups, which I found quite interesting. Which is unsurprising given the space. But I guess for me, that sort of avant-garde tradition was intriguing. I really wanted to explore that more. And certainly in the US, there's also been more of a history of poets of color writing, especially poets of Chinese heritage, who have been writing in the US in the 1960s, 70s, whereas in the UK, poets of Chinese heritage is relatively quite recent, and that, to me, that gap is something I'm still trying to work through, because it's difficult. when you sort of realize, oh, there's something over there that's so shiny, that's so, you know, that you almost want or you desire. But then it's sort of, how do you do that without negating yourself as someone who is British?
Yeah.
I could talk about that for a long time, but
it's such an interesting question, and I guess I just wanted to bring that in, as it feels like it is a part of the book, like you were saying, these kind of the kind of pulling in two different directions. I don't know exactly when the writing would have happened, but it feels part of that. I guess we should close it here. Maybe before I hand over to Jazz, just want to say thank you, Jay, and yeah, I can't believe this is a first book. It's an incredibly accomplished and exciting book, and I am looking forward to seeing all the ways in which it will grow and spread.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. It's been really, really great to hear you discussing the work, and to hear you read again, Jay, was just so fantastic. So thank you both an awful lot, and thank you guys for your messages in the chat and for all your questions in the Q&A. It was great to have you involved as well. I did put the link in the chat for you to go and buy a copy of the book, but as I said, it'll come as an email tomorrow, so don't worry about doing that now. And if you have any problems getting hold of one, just get in touch with me and we'll do our best to help you. So, I mean, that's really everything. Our next launch is in a couple of weeks' time. We're launching Mina Gorgie's second collection, Scale, and she's going to be talking to Banu Kapil about it. So that's going to be a really good one. That's in the chat. Check it out and join us again, please. I will leave everything open for a couple of minutes so you can get your last-minute messages in there. But congratulations, Jay, and thank you guys so much. And good night.